Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Margot Griffith and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I work on the Trothida campus as the Director of Equity and Compliance, and I'm very excited and honored to be part of this series and assisting as today's facilitator. Before I begin, I would like to inform you that this event is being recorded for those who are unable to attend today. We will start out by acknowledging that those at our Trothida campus in Fairbanks are on the unceded customary lands of the Dinaw people of the Tanana River. In Nome, we're on the Inupiaq, Yupik, and Siberian Yupik lands. We honor the continued fight for the rights of First Peoples and stand together in solidarity and action. At UAF, we're growing into a socially just and caring institution of higher education. This ongoing speaker series, titled Shine a Light, Promoting Conversations on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is designed to encourage understanding, build empathy, and engage us in thinking critically about our worldviews. The series is led by UAF's Northwest Campus, but like all great diversity efforts, there are many partnerships and collaborations. We thank the UAF Department of Equity and Compliance and the UAF Nanook Diversity and Action Center for teaming up with the Northwest Campus to bring this series to reality. You can find the recordings of past presentations on the Northwest Campus's website under the Outreach tab. This link will be added to the chat here shortly. We will not have a presentation for the month of July, but we'll resume presentations again in August. Again, thank you for being here today. We hope to see you for future presentations. I would now like to introduce and thank our speaker, Dr. Laverne Helleg-Dementeff, for today's presentation on the 5 C's of healing-centered engagement in academia. Helleg, her family and ancestors are from the area of Holy Cross and Anvik, Alaska. She grew up in Nenana and Anchorage and at her family's fish camp on the Yukon River. She's an associate professor of social work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where she has taught since 2006. Helleg's research and practice areas focus on individual, community, and organizational wellness and healing utilizing a holistic and multi-level framework grounded in Indigenous knowledge and ways of being. So for today's presentation, we ask that you use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that Dr. Dementeff may address at the end of her presentation. You're more than welcome to use the chat feature, but please put your questions in the Q&A feature. So at this time, I'm very pleased and excited to turn the presentation over to Helleg. Thank you so much for being here.
Dr. Margot, thank you so much. I'll just say quickly, Adaya Chuds, hello everyone. Helleg Se'ezret. Helleg means springtime. The name was given to me by the late Jim Dementi. And my name is Laverne Dementeff, as you heard, and I'm super excited to be here to talk about healing-centered engagement in academia. And before we get started, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement, and so we'll just start in a good way with that. In Fairbanks, our Trothida campus is located on the traditional lands of the Dene people of the Lower Tanana River. We acknowledge that these lands on which we live and work are the unceded ancestral lands of the Dene people who stewarded these lands for thousands of years and continue to steward these lands today. I wanted to just add to this. I know Margot also did a land acknowledgement, and one of the things I think about with land acknowledgements is just some of my own personal reflections of gratitude for ancestors and elders as they have carried they've carried the culture and the language over time, the last few hundred years through really, really difficult times, assimilation, colonization, a lot of trauma and challenge. And I just want to express my gratitude to these elders, my ancestors, our elders, for bringing that culture and language forward so that I today can benefit from that. My wellness, my health can benefit from that. I'm super, super grateful. And I just wanted to add that to this land acknowledgement and just recognize them. So as you heard, a lot of the work that I do is focused around healing and resilience, wellness. I did my dissertation on Degaton wellness. And I really, also look at and explore trauma, the impacts of trauma. And I think that, when I do my work, these are some of the things that guide that work. And one of them is Indigenous cultural wisdom and practices must continue to exist for another 10,000 plus years. And as I mentioned, I was giving gratitude to the elders and ancestors for carrying that wisdom forward. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to learn as much as I can so that I can teach that and share that. And people 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, can benefit from that cultural wisdom. And so that's a strong motivation in what I do. And then cultural practices serve as a guide for wellness and healing in our communities and organizations and systems. And these practices plant seeds of wellness in all ages. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of these ancestral and elder wisdom that I think can be utilized here at UAF in all institutions. Indigenous people and communities have the strength, resilience, and ability to confront the challenges that face them. And Indigenous communities should be at the helm of all research, programming, and activities that involve them. So I just wanted to start with this. Over the years, I worked closely with an elder, Elizabeth Flegel, in the social work program. She's a co-teacher in our rural social work cohort. And I've worked with her and other elders around the state to teach in our programs. And not only that, through my research with elders and just in my own life and conversations, I've learned so much about what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be who I am as a Degaton woman. And over time, I pulled out some things that I felt were really important. And I kind of framed them in these 5 C's for healing-centered engagement. And the 5 C's for me are really helpful as a framework to think about and reflect back on. And so I want to offer that to you all as well as a tool. I often use the 5 C's in my classes. I will have students reflect on them throughout the semester. I add it to my syllabus. They're great discussion points. I think we can start the meetings with 5 C's. All of these things, I did a little graphic here just to kind of highlight, I think they could be research codes, daily practices, wellness tools, conversation starters, reflection points, a guide. But anyway, these 5 C's are, as you can see, compassion, connection, community, curiosity, and ceremony. And I'm going to talk through them, but I wanted to just set that framework first and just let you know that a lot of what I'm sharing is just what I've learned from elders over time. So I added this is actually, there's a link on the bottom there to a booklet called Trauma-Informed Practices for Post-Secondary Education. I'm not going to talk too much about the challenges students face in academia, but I did want to mention a couple of things. So if we think about trauma in general, right? So trauma is defined as results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And trauma responses occur when a person's ordinary internal resources for coping and maintaining a sense of control, connection with others, and meaning are overwhelmed by these stressors. And so there are different types of trauma that can happen. So you see there acute trauma, complex trauma, or continuous traumatic stress. And acute trauma really is just a single episode. Oftentimes it's an unexpected event. It could be a car accident or tornado, rape, things like that. Complex or developmental trauma really is sustained or repeated trauma episodes over time. They could be life-threatening illness, combat, ongoing abuse or neglect, or poverty. And then continuous traumatic stress or historical generational trauma is ongoing, it's systemic. So I think about, what students are facing in the world today, and as they're here at the university, living their lives. We've all experienced what happened the past couple of years with COVID, and there's been a lot of loss, and there's been a lot of grief, and there's been a lot of fear. And on top of that, families has other stressors around their finances or housing. It could be any number of things. Part of being human is experiencing challenges on this earth. And so, trauma is fairly prevalent in our society. And here's a couple of statistics. 66 to 94% of students report exposure to at least one traumatic event by the time that they reach college, with many reporting exposure to multiple traumatic events. And then 9 to 12% of first-year college students meet the clinical criteria for PTSD, while many more report symptoms below the diagnostic threshold. Slightly over half of students respondents in 2020 survey reported at least one ACE, so adverse childhood experience. Early traumatic stressors closely tied to a range of negative long-term psychological and life outcomes. So the other piece to this is that student groups demonstrated to be at greater risk of trauma exposure include women, students who are BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ+ students with disabilities, veterans, current and former foster youth, refugee students, and non-traditional adult learners. So there's a lot of challenge out there, a lot of challenge that students are faced with. And I wanted to just kind of set that stage. We're not going to be able, we just don't have time to get into as much discussion or depth around these types of traumas and what that looks like and how that impacts or manifests in our body, but wanted to give you a general overview. So when we think about trauma-informed care, and I don't know if you've heard the term, but it's kind of a buzzword these days. Trauma-informed care is defined as basically an attempt to create a paradigm shift that encourages human service providers to approach their clients' personal, mental, and relational distress with an informed understanding the impact trauma can have on the entire human experience. So that being said, trauma-informed care really is about recognizing this prevalence of trauma that exists in our society. And it's not just trauma, I would say it's just also extreme stress, right? We are under a lot of stress in many different ways, a lot of pressures in our life. And all of these things impact how we learn and how we connect and how we move through the world. So part of being trauma-informed first is to realize, right, the widespread prevalence and impact of trauma. The second thing, once you recognize, this is as part of being human, kind of a human condition, we go through challenges. Trauma is widespread. If you haven't heard about the ACEs study, adverse childhood experiences, that would be a really important one to look at. It really takes you through a lot of, an understanding about how trauma starting early impacts, our life for our whole lives. And so our health and all of that. But it would really be good to, once you kind of recognize, realize the widespread prevalence and the impact of trauma, is to recognize, right, again, signs and symptoms of trauma in students, faculty, and staff. And that is part of being trauma informed. It's really beginning to say, okay, part of understanding trauma is recognizing that when we are in a space fear, when we are in a space of shame, when we have experienced extreme stress and we are lacking coping mechanisms, there are things that we automatically do. We move from our thinking brain, right, our prefrontal cortex, to our emotional brain, our amygdala. And that allows us to really react and keep ourselves safe and things like that. However, it makes it really difficult to learn. So oftentimes we can be in reactive mode. We can get triggered fairly easily and thinking like, if you hadn't heard the term triggered before, it really just means that something in the environment, something stimulated that fear response within you. And it could be as simple as someone raised their voice, someone slammed the door, someone looked at you in a way that reminded you of someone else. It could be a smell. It could be a touch, right? And so there's all kinds of ways that we can get triggered. And I think in classrooms, oftentimes students may get triggered by the material that is being discussed. And so we're not talking about that today, but that's actually a really good presentation, trigger warnings, and thinking about that as well. So recognize signs and symptoms of trauma in students, recognize how that manifests in the body. Withdrawal and disconnection often is a sign that you might see too, just withdrawing and disconnecting, or even just wanting to argue and things like that. So those are signs that someone's experiencing something in their life. I think we kind of naturally know some of these things. So the third part is respond, right? So it's kind of like once you know something, once you understand trauma, you recognize that it's prevalent, you understand how it manifests in the body and how people react. Once you understand that, then and you know that, you can't really unknow that. And so how do we respond? And that's the other piece of trauma-informed care, is really kind of thinking through, how do we respond and put into practice things that help manage the classroom better, help students learn better, right? And we'll talk about that in this presentation. And then the last part is to resist, right? Resist re-traumatization and promote learning and growth. And, no one, wants to re-traumatize someone, or there's no one that has that intention. As faculty members, we are not, there in thinking about re-traumatization, but sometimes through our actions, those things can occur. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. So one of the things that has been written about more recently, so there's been trauma-informed care. There's a Indigenous scholar in Canada. Her name is Natalie Clark, and she has just got really amazing insight into trauma-informed care. And I added a couple of her videos here. I think they're really worth the watch. But one of the things that she has done is she talks about moving from this trauma-informed care to healing-centered care. And she said there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, trauma-informed care really centers kind of trauma, right? Even in just the term. And, even though we might know that's not what we are wanting to do, is to focus on the trauma and really, really think about the trauma. Just because it's in the name, it oftentimes conjures first and foremost, what's the trauma here, right? And so she says, we can decenter that by utilizing healing-centered care, which is really centering then healing in the way that we interact with people. And so the other thing that happens when we shift from trauma-informed care to healing-centered care is that, and I wrote this on the bottom here, we often discuss trauma as an individual personal problem, right? And so we think, if someone has experienced trauma, that's within themselves, and they are maybe should be taught coping practices or get, support and therapy and different things. However, trauma does not exist in that way as just an individual problem. It exists within our society and is impacted by all the different levels of our society. So healing-centered engagement means contextualizing the wide-scale collective harm many communities experience and thinking through the actions groups can take together to chip away at societal root causes. It decenters trauma and centers healing. So again, Natalie Clark has just got a wealth of resources I think you'd really enjoy. We're going to be talking through some of these things, both trauma-informed care and healing-centered engagement principles are things like, how do we begin to build safety and trust in our classroom? How do we promote calming or teach emotional regulation or co-regulation skills in our classroom? How do we promote a sense of self-efficacy and collective efficacy, or just empowerment? How do we promote connectedness or instill hope? How do we promote compassion or a sense of belonging and love? How do we promote community, well-being and collaboration, shared decision-making? And then also, are we using an equity lens and addressing inequalities? So from a healing-centered engagement perspective, these would be some of the principles, and we'll talk through some of these. So I wanted to start back, just kind of remind you, I want to just kind of go through these 5 C's for healing-centered engagement. And the first one I often talk about is compassion. And I have a picture of Elizabeth Flegel here, who co-teaches with me in the Rural Social Work Cohort Program. And she is my elder mentor. She often brings this is her beautiful smile, but also her heart and lots of love to the classroom. And that element of compassion and love that she brings, she often tells students she's proud of them, she missed them, she loves them. And I think it's kind of unprecedented in a university system for students to hear that. But what I see happening is that it creates this space of safety. And, students are often so inspired by the elder in the classroom and just feel comfortable to be who they are in the world. And it allows them to engage, I believe, at the deepest levels of learning when we are able to create these spaces. So compassion, oftentimes, many of our elders model this. They talk about it, right? They teach about love and care, sharing and caring for others. So it's a prevalent part of life. And I honestly believe that things like compassion and love belong in our organizations and institutions. I was approached by my uncle, 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. And he said, I'm worried about you, was what he was saying, that you're in this institution here at UAF. And that, in these institutions and organizations, we often get in our heads, right? We can walk around planning and thinking, and we're often in our heads, and we have deadlines and we have things we're doing. And he said, when you're in that space for too long and you're disconnected from the rest of your body and your heart, you can miss things. You can miss vital signs that you're tired or stressed, that you need support. And it doesn't allow you to connect as a human being to other human beings as well. And so he said, I want you to practice every day, moving from your head to your heart, and just from moving from your head to your heart. And I started doing that. And I have to say, if there's one thing that I hope you take away from today, that would be maybe one of the things that you do is practice moving from your head to your heart and shifting the energy into this heart-centered space, which is around connectedness. And it having that level of compassion, I think, during the day, because I still go into my head space, right? But I really practice trying to get back into my heart space, especially if I'm going into a meeting or if I'm doing something like this. I want to make sure that I'm really connecting to my heart space. And in that, there's compassion for self and there's compassion for others. And as we move through the world, we have our own stressors and struggles, and Having compassion for ourselves as we do the work that we do is so vital. And I think the more that we have and build that for ourselves, the more that it just kind of exudes to others. And when that exudes to others, there's an element of feeling cared about, right? Feeling acknowledged. So students then also benefit from that. But it allows us to get into that space of connection. And I have to tell you that when I did that, I felt like I was a better teacher. I connected better to my students, to my colleagues, and I was more loving to myself. And that was really helpful. So, so that's compassion. And so I think that maybe Margot can get you these slides too, so that you can have some of this stuff. So I won't go over all of it, but I just wanted to say I added some practices, right? Just some thoughts to, or some things to remember about what I'm talking about. There's some great resources out there. Trauma Stewardship by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. She has an amazing TED Talk, and there's, some professional quality of life scale that can, screen for stress related issues. Many people don't, when they think of burnout, they often think, of things that are just like internal or things that are taxing them. I'm just overworked and stressed out, but burnout and compassion fatigue and things like that are oftentimes come from multiple places. Oftentimes it's our own personal work environment, our own home environments, and then the energy and the impact from our students, right? All of that oftentimes coincides to create burnout. And so anyway, this is a great tool for that. I also ended with this, just some questions, right? Do learning activities in your classroom help rehumanize education by focusing on what it means to be human? And so this is just a great conversation to have. What does it mean to be human, and how does that look in our classroom? And a lot of what we're talking about today is that, right? That we are human, we are whole human beings. We bring all of the challenges as well as all of the knowledge and the joys, all of that to every situation that we come to. And with that, we are whole people. And so just acknowledging that sometimes is the start, right? All right, so the other piece the next piece is connection. And connection really is something that elders often talk about in thinking about just how we're connected to the world around us, right? We're connected to land, to animals, to each other in so many ways, right? Relationality is so important in our practices, and not just for Indigenous people, but all people. We're relational beings. And so connection is, you think about anyone that experiences intense challenge. It could be depression or anxiety or addiction. It could be just overly stressed, overly burdened, right, with work and school, right? When we are so taxed, we oftentimes disconnect, right? We take a step back, we disconnect sometimes from ourselves, from our own bodies. We disconnect from family sometimes, or just from work or from culture, from our community, from groups that we're a part of, from spirit, from nature, right? When we are experiencing challenges, sometimes it's really hard to be in these spaces, so we disconnect. So I think a job of ours, especially as faculty, is how do we help students reconnect back up, right? So finding connection here in academia in some form or fashion with an advisor, with a faculty member, that relationship is so important, that connection, helping them become part of groups, helping them reconnect back up. I wanted to show you a little bit of information about relationality. It's such a foundational and important concept. And I think that, relationality, there was a book by Sean Wilson called Research is Ceremony. And that's kind of where I first heard of the term, even though I understood relationality as an Indigenous person. But he talked about it in regards to research. And he said, relationality in research, if we're working with individuals or communities in research, we have to understand what relationships are important to people that we're working with and get to know those relationships and understand what relationships are important. And he said, but you can't stop there. You then have to think about how are you as the researcher being accountable to those relationships once you know about them. And I just want to say, we can apply that. You can take those same concepts and apply those to students. What relationships are important to students? And how can we as an institution be accountable to that? I think that, so many of our students in rural communities are committed to their communities, to being in their communities, and they have roles and responsibilities. And when things happen, whether it's deaths or something else happens in the community, that's their responsibility, right? To be there, to be a part of that community's grieving and healing and celebration and those types of things. There's very students value that, right? But they're often then, as they're trying to get an education, pulled in a lot of different directions and sometimes conflicting, right? And so they're trying to maintain their responsibility to their communities and to their families and to their kinship and all to the seasons, to the land, to nature, at the same time trying to get an education, which is, oftentimes going to help them better the quality of life in the community. So I often think about, they value those more than the educational process. And so they might make those choices. But what can we do to really support people's relationality here in academia, right? And I know social work is fairly unique in the sense that makes sense for us, but I do think this can apply across the board as well. I think about students and I think, wow, if we can support that relationality, helping them to be strong, well people in their communities and giving them, allowing flexibility and just support and understanding, having them bring some of that to the classroom, that makes them better social workers. And so, I think that's the bigger picture of it. And so just kind of thinking through some of these things. But relationality is a really interesting topic. And so I pulled out some things. I know this is just a lot of stuff here, but relationality ultimately is about how do we strengthen our relationships, all relationships. How do we strengthen, are we doing the work? So anything that we do in any way that we move here in academia, are we strengthening relationships? Are we strengthening the relationships around us? And if we are, that's perfect. That's so great. And if we're not, then that's something I think we need to reflect on. So a little bit, I'll just pull out a couple of things here. Research and work with clients and communities from a Western perspective is often extractive. It's non-relational and it can be invasive, using strict timeframes, restrictive policies and procedures, hierarchical notions of expertise, and colonial discourses of discovery, finding the gap and collecting data. Many of these kind of Western rigid approaches are not very relational at all. But how can we, begin to explore that and think about how we can turn those around to make them more relational? Relationality is also about connecting to unwanted messages as well. So like feeling the grief of the community or the land, right? There are lessons in that as well about being a good relative in that grief and those challenges that are faced. There are good lessons in there. So relationality isn't just about, thinking about all the good that's happening, but it's also connected to these challenges in life. As an ethic of responsibility, relationality is something that is practiced. It's something you do every day and you practice it, right? And you think about it and reflect on it and you do things because it's about strengthening relationships. To conceive of something or someone as other is to sever that inherent relationship between things and reify certain peoples or ideas as more important We often use this term in a lot of ways, but the other person often severs that relationship. So, being thoughtful about how we word things. And then we become as we emerge together. And I thought that was really beautiful. We become as we emerge together. And I've gotten a lot of this quotes here just from the Joanne Archibald's book called Indigenous Storywork, and then Sean Wilson's book, Research as Ceremony. And the last question I would just pose is, is your classroom helping students learn how to become better relatives? And I think, again, it's one of those really deep questions that you have to reflect on. What does that mean? And take the time to really think about, and there's a couple of examples like using sharing circles where students learn to listen and listen to learn. But I really love that question. Is your classroom helping students learn how to become better relatives? I'm going to go through some of this. This is just a visual of the disconnection that happens to self, family, community, culture, nature, and spirit. And how can we build connections in these areas? And I see questions, and I think we're going to have questions towards the end here, but I also added to some of this stuff because I think it's a really great, some of this is just a good visual, right? And just thinking about how we move from our prefrontal cortex to our emotional brain when we are stressed or when we're experiencing or feeling unsafe or feeling, at all attacked, right? That we often flip our lid. And so this is a great hand model, just kind of highlighting this prefrontal cortex, flipping your lid. In here is the amygdala, the thumb part, right? And so that's where we're operating, which is really hard to plan and think through your consequences when you're in this space. And I get here, I'm here quite often. I have a trauma history. I also have a resilience history. And so I think about, we have to learn tools and strategies to be able to and talk about those and make them normalized. Like, yeah, this is a real thing. Like, let's take a moment here. And I mean, I think one thing that I've said in the past is, I am here to support you. I'm here to support you. Right? I want you to be successful, and how can I help? And so that helps, taking a deep breaths or just, taking a minute if you need it, actually naming the stress, right? Helps us to bring that back down so that we're back in our thinking brain and we can actually hear someone and learn. And again, this is such a short time. This is a whole, I think this takes a lot of practice and a lot of intentionality. But I love that that we can share it and that I know that there are faculty out there that are doing these things. If you haven't heard about ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the state of Alaska has a History and Hope workshop that talks about adverse childhood experiences in Alaska and the impact of that on our bodies and brains and how that impacts our health. And it's just a really good presentation, and they do free presentations across Alaska. So anyway, I wanted to share that. So, so connection, right? I think the question that I posed is, do your rubrics reflect holistic measures of success, such as connection and self-actualization? And then the next C is community. Our elders yearn for community. They talk about the times when we move together from camp to camp, fall camp, summer camp, winter camp, going berry picking as a number of families going berry picking together, fishing together. They yearn for community, eeling together. And when I talk to elders, that's one of the things that they bring up a lot, is that they really want to see creation of community and people being involved in community. There's so much to be learned in community. There's so much support in community. There's a lot of relationality in community. There's a lot of healing that happens in community. And so I asked the question, is the classroom truly a community of learners where they feel safe and willing to take transformative risks? And there's a great video, again, by Natalie Clark. I posted the link in the last slide, called ABCs of Self-Care. And she's so great at talking about some of these things. And she talks about self-care and says, yes, let's do that for ourselves, and we need to explore that. But she said, what's even bigger that we can begin to build is a community of care, right? And so there's a lot to that in thinking about community of care, meaning that it's not just me practicing my self-care, but it's us, either in our classroom or as an institution, really thinking about how are we caring and teaching and talking about, how we're doing and building in practices of care in multiple ways, so that we all benefit. And so it's a really great, it's just like a 7-minute video, but super good. I think I alluded to this earlier, but one of the things that I would just mention is that that we are whole people, right? And there's a lot to this part of the conversation too that we can't get to, but I don't think that I always felt comfortable being a whole person, right? All of the trauma that I experienced, there was a lot of shame attached to that. And when I went through my own healing, that I was able to come to a place where I recognized that being a whole person today, being able to be all that I am, the good and the bad, right, actually makes me better and stronger in all areas of my life. And so I embraced that, but not everybody still feels safe to be a whole human being, right? There's still a lot of discrimination and inequity out there that makes it really difficult. But that's the goal. When we can be whole people, that's where our power lies. That's where our strength lies. And anyway, I just wanted to share that. This is my dad, by the way. So we went through compassion, we went through connection, we went through community. The next one is curiosity. And I think this one is so important, as elders have always talked to us about observing and noticing the signs from the universe and just thinking about, always learning, right? And so I add this because I think part of our job really is to be curious about what's, about that relationality. What relationships are important to you? What are your strengths? What happened? How can I help you? Right? Be curious about these things. Recognize that trauma is prevalent. Let's learn about that. Let's talk about what trauma-informed care and trigger warnings and things like that look like in our classrooms. And then here's just, I'm not going to go through that, but there's some ways to think about it here. And then I ask at the end of this one, are you as the instructor being intellectually and culturally inclusive in different ways of knowing and being? And then the last one is ceremony. And I was listening to Elder Wilson Justin talk once, and he said, as Indigenous people, we wouldn't be here without ceremony. And because ceremony, as we've experienced challenges in our life, ceremony is what brought us back together as a community, brought us back into balance in our bodies, back to connected to spirit or to nature, to the land. Ceremony does those things, right? It helps us to regain balance. And Indigenous people are not the only one that practice ceremony. Ceremony is practiced by all people, and it looks different depending on who you are and your context. But one of the things I was thinking about, that's a good way to practice ceremony at the university is starting and ending your class in a good way, right? And so oftentimes when we elders say we start in a good way, it brings everybody together on the same page, because we all come to class or to the meetings with all this energy, right? Energy from the world, energy from our lives. It could be good or bad, but we're all coming with all of this energy from our different spaces, and we all come together, and maybe we just take a couple minutes to do a deep breathing exercise, or maybe we start with a poem, or we do a quick check-in, right? whatever that looks like, when you begin to start in a good way, people can get on, we can all get on the same energy and begin to release some of that from our life, from our day, and be present and learn. And so these are just really good tools, I think, to use in a classroom. And the question that I pose is, do you take time to authentically welcome others in a humble, respectful way? And I know that we're coming to a close here. And, I just want to say, grounding ourselves in hope, right? I think we have to ground ourselves in this work in hope. There's a lot of challenges out there, but when we focus on the challenge so much, we can become overwhelmed. We can just become super, we don't know where to start, because if you focus on a challenge, you begin to see all of it, and it becomes like this huge mountain that becomes a hurdle, and it's hard to know where to start, how to get over it. It can even feel like, I don't even want to tackle that. And so start with hope, right? Here's something to keep in mind. For every trauma history, individual, family, group, or community, there's a survival or wellness history, a history of resilience. And when we start with that, it opens us up to possibilities and solutions. And I would just say, Eduardo Duran wrote this book called Healing the Soul Wound, and I often share it. And he's a therapist in California. I'm not sure if he's still there, but in his book, he talks about telling his clients, when they come and see him, that they're in a really powerful place. And of course, his clients are like, they don't feel powerful. I'm like, why? I don't feel like I have any power. And so what are you talking about? And he says, well, you made that first step, the movement, right, to get help, or to movement toward wellness, whatever it was, you made that. You might have called, you might have came into my office, but you made that movement. And when you did that, it sent out ripples of energy, healing ripples around to the people around you. So in your family, in your neighborhood, in your community, in your state, like the ripples just keep going, and it actually ripples behind us and to our ancestors and begins to heal them, and it actually is rippling forward, and so that it's healing your grandchildren. That is a really powerful place to be in. So when we make movements like that, we're creating change, even if the movements are really small, towards wellness and support. And think about, if we did this all together, the ripples are just going to be even bigger. So I would just end with that. And I'm super grateful for you listening. My voice is a little scratchy today. There's my email. I hope that we can have these conversations in the future. I'm open to them if you want to email me. I think about it all the time in academia. How can we do this? How can we support students better, and how can we be more effective? How can we keep them and graduate them and as whole people?
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and the messages that you brought through your presentation. I know I needed to hear it, and there are many people out there that really needed to hear this. And we do have a few questions for you that came through, and one that we've seen a couple times in the chat is, can we please have your presentation?
Of course.
So would you be willing to share that with us? Awesome.
Yeah.
We can get that posted on the website along with the video. And we have a big one. So the practices you're describing seem antithetical to higher education as we know it. The competitive, individualistic, unemotional, work until you drop type mentality. How have other faculty, particularly those outside of your field, responded to the idea of implementing healing-centered practices? And does that implementation look different depending on the discipline?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is the question, right? I think that, like I mentioned, having an elder in the classroom creates the space of love and support and safety. That's not something everyone is comfortable with or understands. I don't think it's something that, there may be a pocket of, I know of only a few people. Diane McCachran has Elders in Bethel, RHS, Humes, and social work. I know that maybe psych has had in past programs have had elders, but even just taking that example, right? That's thinking about that and compassion and love. It just, you're right. It doesn't seem to connect. However, as I've experienced working closely with elders in this space and working closely with students in a relational way, I've seen the transformation. I've seen the depth of engagement that people are able to go to, and connectedness. And it's a beautiful thing. And what I tell my students that are going out into the social work profession is that here at the university, when I go into a space, I bring my heart and I talk about it in meetings. We have I'm in a CLA summit this week, and the first time we met, I talked about the 5 C's and I talked about compassion. And I would have to say, even though we're uncomfortable or maybe unsure about how that looks in academia or in institutions or organizations, people yearn for it. They yearn to be seen as whole human beings. They yearn for connectedness. They yearn to be in a space where they can really be who they are and show and feel cared about. People yearn for that, right? And what the institution does is often just, creates these silos and all these barriers and causes us to be in our heads. All of this can be really overwhelming to think about. So honestly, when I've talked about this to others, I've been really surprised, faculty and staff here at UIF. I don't know that I've been surprised, but there has been great like-mindedness. I don't know if that's the right word, but just there's been a lot of support, a lot of yeah, I actually do something similar in my class. This is how I am. This is, these are the kinds of, I would love to see more of this in the classrooms, kinds of things. And, I think that it definitely takes us it's important just to talk about it and be open and share some of these things. And your other question, I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I always tell my students, the only way, a big way that we can make change is to be that change, right? And so going into a space, that is what I will be. And that energy then emanates and people can pick up on that. And it allows them to be who they are, right? And we're creating spaces of healing and support and humanness. And that's a really small thing that we can do. I think it does take a lot of work. I took a lot of work for me anyway, to become more whole and more healed, and to bring that out into the world. But the other piece is cross disciplines. And, I think I don't think it matters if you're in a math class or a science class. If you think about the mechanics of it, I guess, and you recognize students will struggle if they are in their emotional brains, if they are super stressed, if they are feeling fear, if they have test anxiety, if they are, going through major challenges, they just will. And there are ways to help them to get back into a good space so that they are successful. And if you are a faculty member that wants your students to be successful, it doesn't matter if you're in math or science or wherever, social work and wherever, right? Because then okay, well, it doesn't have to always be, meditation or things like that, but there are small things that you can do that help get people feeling more safe and supported. And so it's just a great conversation to have. I don't have all the answers. I'm working on it in my program, in my department, in our college, but I don't have all the answers. And I just think we have a lot of work to do together around this. And so I'm very open to that.
Thank you. Excuse me, my voice is giving me troubles today too. Yes, thank you so much for this. And I don't see any other questions, but I do want to say thank you so much. And I'm going to quote Daphne Young, who said, "Thank you for your beautiful, spirit-filled, generous insights and questions we can wonder with." I don't think I could have put that any better. So thank you, Daphne, for that. And thank you so much, Dr. Dementief. We so appreciate you being here and want to say thank you to everybody who has joined us today. Please keep an eye out for upcoming Shine a Light presentations at the nwc.uaf.edu website or on facebook.com/uaf.nwc. If you'd like to share the recording or give feedback, you can do so by visiting the courses tab on the Northwest Campus website. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you next time.